Okay, hi everybody. Just before we begin, I wanted to warn everybody that the first half of the workshop will be recorded and it will be shared on our website, but to facilitate the dialogue and to create a safe space, our second portion will not be recorded. First, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land where I play, live, and work are the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin people, because I'm in the Outaouais, which is a secret land for many Anishinaabe people to have come through and traveled on. I would also like to acknowledge that Quebec is home to more than 50 communities on this territory, and as well as many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people whose footsteps have marked the land for generations. Okay. Hi, my name is Chris. I am, I guess, agent de soutien for l'AIDQ. I work on a project called VSC, which is the valorization of experiential knowledge. I guess I'll pass it on to Julie Soleil.
Hey, everybody. My name is Julie Soleil Missen. I'm trying to translate my title. So this would knowledge translator and content manager for l'AIDQ. So it's nice to see you guys. Isabelle.
So hi, everyone. My name is Isabelle Boisvert. So I'm co-animating today. I was on crack and heroin for 15 years. I used drugs for 20 years. I was on methadone and Suboxone on and off for years. I was treated for hepatitis C twice due to needle sharing. Over the years, I used a lot of various services across Quebec for harm reduction. I went to more than 10 therapies. I went to detox. I lived in sober living apartments for mothers and with their children. I was hospitalized numerous times for psychosis, overdoses, infections, all related to my drug use. My drug use also eventually led me to become homeless. And many of my loved ones died, sorry, including my son's dad, my best friend, and many others. And I faced a lot of stigma over the years through the system and from society in general. This week I'll be 3 years sober, but I do want to say that although sobriety was a solution for me, I don't think it's everyone's solution, which is why I think harm reduction is extremely important. And I consider myself to be an expert with lived experience with substance use. And on a more professional level, since almost a year, I work as a consultant and I do contracts like I'm doing today. So I co-animate and share my story. I'm also a patient partner at the CRISM. And I work since 2 years, well, since 2020, I work full-time as a community liaison and research agent for the Centre de Recherche, CRCHUM, Centre de Recherche du CHUM. Puis, so I work on a variety of projects to improve the quality and access to services for people who use and inject drugs. I develop partnerships with community resources that serve people who use. And I also sit on a variety of committees related to harm reduction. And under my mandate with CRISM and the CHUM and the CRCHUM, the AIDQ and I created the tool that we'll present today. So it's very nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Oops. Sorry.
I guess everybody presented themselves. Sorry about that, guys. Today's workshop goals and objectives will be to better understand stigma, what stigma is and how it affects people that experience it, The second point that we'll be doing is to discover new awareness and reflect upon and reference tool, I guess, a reflection and reference tool. Also, to reinvest this learning and to use this tool in with your practice and within your organization. The agenda, I guess, the schedule for today will be part 1, which is recorded. It'll be about what is stigma, awareness tool presentation, stigma in the intervention. Let's be aware of it. And we're going to go to break. And then we're going to go to the second part, which is not recorded, which is the interactive activity. And then we're going to finish with our conclusion. I'm going to pass it back to Gisele.
That was a classic, so I guess it's going to be recorded. Sorry, it's because I want to share a little video on stigma, a tool that has been done by Katie in the harm reduction fundamentals, and then we will start on going through what stigma is and how people live it. So let me share my screen. I have to share the sound, so I'm sorry, I had to restart that. Oh.
What are stigma and discrimination? There are 3 main types of stigma: structural stigma, social or public stigma, and individual or self-stigma. Structural stigma refers to policies or practices of institutions, for example, governments, healthcare systems, service providers, that intentionally restrict the rights and opportunities of stigmatized individuals or lead to unintentional consequences for stigmatized individuals. For example, structural stigma is in evidence when people who use drugs experience discrimination from first responders or healthcare professionals. Structural stigma can also be the reason why services may be designed to exclude people who use drugs, such as when abstinence, not using drugs, is required to access services. Social or public stigma refers to the exclusion and stereotypes associated with different groups of people. Social stigma is perpetuated when negative labels about people who use drugs are employed in everyday conversations and in the media. When negative images are used to depict people who use drugs and their families, and when people who use drugs and their families are ignored. Individual or self-stigma occurs when a person internalizes social and structural stigma. It happens when they take negative messages and labels they see about their group and apply them to themselves. Self-stigma can affect how a person thinks about themselves and their relationships with others.
So as you can see in this video, I'm going to just share my screen again. I'm sorry, I'll start with that because I can't do 2 things at the same time. So as you can see in this video, people who use substances live different forms of stigma: structural, social, and public, or self-stigma. In this webinar, we will be concentrated more on structural stigma, where people who use drugs are discriminated by service responders, like first responders or healthcare professionals. People who use drugs live high levels of stigma and discrimination because of the criminalization of the behavior of using drugs, and it makes them not get the same services as everyone else. Stigma breaks down trust, prevents communication, and leads to shame and marginalization. While studies show that the type and extent of stigma varies depending on the drugs used, other research have confirmed that stigma is so pervasive in relation to drug use that it is an experience that is experienced by virtually all drug users. Thus, there is agreement that people who use substances are people who experience stigma. Stigma can be used as a tool of oppression to take people's power away. People who use certain substances experience consistent oppression due to many interrelated parts of their identities. In order to dismantle stigma, especially for marginalized people, a healthy relational climate must be created so that people who are impacted by substance use can feel safe accessing support of services. Privilege is the access to power by the dominant group. Privilege gives economic, social, and political advantages at the expense of marginalized groups. Privilege is about holding power in society and having a certain level of opportunities and inputs in society. This leads us to talk about intersectionality, which is an accumulation of different forms of domination and discrimination experienced by a person based on, among other things, their ethnicity, gender, age, religion, sexual orientation, social class, or physical abilities, which results in an increase in the prejudice suffered. Intersectionality states that there are multiple forms of oppression within our social structures, and each of these forms intersect and support each other. This means that an individual can hold multiple identities, making them privileged or oppressed at the same time, or to have to face multiple forms of oppression at the same time. For example, an individual may encounter gender-based violence, racism, homophobia, transphobia, albinism, mental health, and stigma of being a person who uses drugs. Anti-oppression is about decreasing harm. Privilege can create an inability to see many of the ways people cause harm. The harm of oppression cannot be countered until people understand their place of privilege in the world and actively work to use the power of this privilege in ways that support marginalized groups instead of oppressing them. Stigma is harmful because it creates barriers to people accessing healthcare, legal support, and vital social services. This perpetuates a harmful cycle where those who would most benefit from help cannot access it and are further marginalized in society. A colleague of mine shared with me her testimony on stigmatizing language. Several years ago, when language became a hot topic or issue, or we started to change to people first language, I used to think, what's all the fuss about? It's not worthwhile or all that important. Fast forward to recent years, I know now that language matters a great deal. It triggers images, emotion, and an internal dialogue that we have with ourselves, depending on where you come from, your life experiences and life exposure is how that language signals your internal dialogue. Empathy and understanding or lack of thereof, and whether or not you feel certain lives matter or perhaps others have done this to themselves and therefore don't deserve the same respect. This brings me to talk about the death of Joyce Eshwakan, which occurred under despicable circumstances on September 28th, 2020, at the Joliette Hospital in Lanaudière, Quebec, near the Atikamekw community of Manawan. This horrible situation was not the first, but a video witnessed it. This horrible situation was the spark that led to the presentation of this brief by the Atikamekw Council of Manawan and the Atikamekw Nation Council. According to them, it is time for governments to take a firm stand against systemic racism towards Indigenous people and within the health and social services systems. This principle is a declaration, a call to action, and a commitment to governments to put an end to an intolerable and unacceptable situation. They put forward 5 proposals in their implementation. Proposal 1 and 2 is the relationship between Indigenous people and the government of Canada and Quebec in the matters of health and social services. One of the actions for say would be to recognize the systemic racism that Indigenous people face in the government. The third one is the relationship between Indigenous people and the general public in matters of health and social services. There must be an active commitment to addressing racism against Indigenous people. The importance of awareness and education of non-Indigenous people about the realities of Indigenous people must be recognized. The fourth one is in relationship with educational institution. Here is said that, for example, any program offered by an educational institution to train health and social service workers must include a component related to Indigenous people. And lastly, relationship between Indigenous people and the health and social service regarding professional associations. For example, l'AIDQ has adopted the Joyce principles, and we are putting actions into place for our members, for us also in our organization, so we can be leaders in that sense. So I will pass the next part to my colleague Isabelle, who is going to present to you the guide. The guide, I guess. The tool, sorry.
Thank you, Julie Soleil. So before I share my screen, I wanted to say that the tool we're presenting was an amazing collaboration between l'AIDQ and the CRISM Pôle Québec, which stands for the Canadian Research Initiative in Substance Misuse. The reality is that stigma associated to substance use exists and plays a big role in the quality and types of services provided in the healthcare system. It affects negatively the emotional and physical well-being of people who consume. And we felt it was important to create a tool like this one. So here it is. I will share my screen. So I put it, okay, so just to begin, it's, sorry, I will go slower. So, wait, I need to hide the faces, right? Okay. So it's a 10-page tool, document, sorry. We created it in English and French, and we created a virtual format, which is this one, but also a print format. So I will go, sorry, I'm going a bit fast, but I will go back to a single page view. Okay, so, sorry, I'm just trying to gather my thoughts here. So I'll just go to page 1. Je vais réduire un peu. So I'll summarize what page, what the context, the introduction page is saying. Basically, the tool presents 3 real-life cases where people felt stigmatized due to their drug use. The target audience is, we intended it primarily for professionals in the healthcare sector. But it can also raise awareness in other contexts such as public safety, education, research, and community. The stories that were shared with us, so these 3 stories reflect harmful behaviors and actions that contribute to stigma, discrimination, and marginalization. Each study shows the immediate impact on the individuals, their substance use, and the services rendered. This tool provides an overview of how to contribute to effective care in the healthcare sector and reduce short to long-term harm to people who consume and their loved ones. And each case study has questions to encourage discussion and reflections either by yourself or with your colleagues. So I'll move on to, sorry, I will move on to the next page. This is the quote that Julie Soleil already shared with us. So the first case study relates to a stigmatizing experience in a detox center in Quebec. My colleague Chris will cover it, we'll go through it in more detail together a bit later in today's workshop. Then there's a section on the feelings and emotions felt by the person who shared their story, what happened afterwards, and what could have made a difference, a positive difference, what could have, you know, how the staff that, you know, dealt with this person could have done a more positive difference. And then there are questions to open discussion and reflect. And yeah, so that's that. Then the second case study is in a hospital care setting in Quebec also. So this is the second testimony that we got. Then it's the same format for each case study. So what feelings and emotions were felt by the person who shared their story, what happened afterwards, how to do it differently. And there's reflection questions, which are different for each case study. And we'll do some group work later so that we can, you know, understand how to, sorry, I'm struggling with my screen here, to, you know, so that you really understand how you can use this tool. And the third case study is in a rehab center and is regarding people, well, the person who shared their story was someone on OAT, so on methadone. And so it's, you know, how it was hard to access services in Quebec because of that. And it's, again, it's the same format again, with different questions than the previous two cases. And the last page of the toolbox, the last page is what we call the toolbox or toolkit, which my colleague Julie Sade will present to you in a few minutes. I'll just make it a bit more visible. And after Julie Sade presents this to us, we'll have a Q&A session if you have any questions regarding this document. So Julie Soleil, please go ahead. I'll keep sharing my screen.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, so we tried to get a whole bunch of different tools that could be helpful in continuing and learning a little bit more and going a little bit further in this topic and helping maybe recognize or even have the discussions that are there. So there's different types of materials here. All of these, I think, one or two are only in French, but most of them are in English. But we did try to get the most, like in the toolkit in French and the toolkit in English, we tried really to make sure that the tools were in the language that the tool was made. So there are some on, there's many different organizations that have worked on this kind of issue and have put forward a lot of different things on it. There's the Blood Ties 4 Direction Center that is a really good document on Don't Be an A-hole, best practices for health and social service providers working with people who use drugs. So this organization is based in the Yukon, and they've worked out a whole bunch of things, and it has a whole bunch of tools and it has things to print. It's quite a good a basic, like going through a whole bunch of things, but a big work that was done there with research and stuff like that. There's the Canadian Center on Substance Use, Overcoming Stigma, Online Learning and Multimedia. There's a whole website, all kinds of tools there in French and in English, both languages. As you know, the Canadian Center on Substance Use and Addictions always publish in both languages. Others that are similar and do little things, there's the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition that did the stigma and substance use, whole bunch of different tools there, a whole bunch of stuff that are really interesting and can be helpful, and towards a lot of other sites and a lot of organizations that are working on this today. The CAIDI, the Canadian Source for HIV and Hepatitis C, just got out a tool called Harm Reduction Fundamentals, a toolkit for service providers. This is 4 different units on different aspects of substance use and and really going through different aspects of it. AIDQ collaborated with them, and Manitoba Harm Reduction and Streetworks and a whole bunch of organizations across Canada to really put forward these. And it's like it's a You can go from one unit to another. You can do so, like the little capsule that we saw at the beginning was from there. There's a whole bunch of tools, but there's also learning. So it's an e-learning site, so you can go through and do a course on it. So if there's certain things that you're not familiar with, it's a great tool to get into. The Drug Research and Education Project is a project on holistic drug checking and stuff like that. But I'm one of the authors on this with two of my colleagues from West Canada. And the first chapter we wrote, it doesn't need to be regarded from drug checking. It's creating safer spaces, harm reduction. And there's a whole section on stigma, oppression, intersectionality, and different exercises that you can do too that are really, really cool. Équipe de soutien clinique et organisationnel en dépendance. It's only in French, but there too, there's so many different tools and they're starting to translate them. So I'm seeing a lot more translation there. A lot more of the tools are coming out in English also. So it's a good site to go to. And then there's a whole bunch of other little, like the government, Hamilton, these are really like other things on stigma. One of the other things that's important, like I was talking about the words matter. The Maiden and Henderson one is really, really good. It's made by the International Network of People Who Use Drugs and the Asian Network of People Who Use Drugs. It's in English and in French. It's a very, very cool document. And then you have a couple of videos that I thought were good. Decolonizing Substance Use and Addiction is a 15-minute TED Talk by a person from First Nations, and he really gets into the subject, and it's really, really good. And then there's Shahen Hussein, who has written some stuff, and there's a whole with Amnesty International Canada pour en finir avec la colonialisme médical. It's in French, but it's really, really interesting, and it's 2 hours and a half with 4 different service providers, doctors and nurses, but all indigenous from different communities, and they talk about their work and stigma and everything that's happened towards that. And the last one, look for helping support concerning your drug use or addiction. Trouve ton centre has all the centers in prevention, harm reduction, and for treatment all across Quebec. So you can go and find different resources that you need. Voila. Hope that was helpful. And I'm going to let Chris, we'll go back to the first segment, the first, how do you say, sorry. The case study, I'm sorry, I was thinking in French. The first case study, and I'll let Chris read it to you, and then we'll tell you where we're going to go with that.
All right.
Cool. Thanks, Judy today. Here we go. So one of the first case studies that we have, I'm going to read you the experience out loud. So after 3 weeks of heavy drug use, and I was only up for only 8 hours of sleep, I felt much despair and discouragement, and I wanted to end my life. Following the failed suicide attempt in the middle of the night, I contacted my mother, who called 911 to come rescue me. My mother didn't know how to help me anymore. She had been desperately trying to save me from my drug addiction for years. When the police arrived, they offered to accompany me to a detox center. While notifying the center that they were on their way, the police brought me a meal. They were very kind and helpful. Once we arrived to the center, I found the receptionist cold and unwelcoming. Her attitude was very negative towards me. She said I had to wait in the lobby until the detox nurse and the counselor could meet with me. She told the police officers that I had been admitted 6 months before, and I chose to leave the same day. As such, I was no longer a priority because I didn't really want the help. A police officer had to talk with her for at least 30 minutes until she finally agreed to admit me into detox. She explained that I needed to wait on a wooden bench in the lobby until admission. The police officer had to leave for other calls, so they kindly gave me an aluminum blanket to keep warm. I fell asleep on the bench. Still today, I'm very grateful for these agents. 4 hours later, I was abruptly woken by a loud cry. You have to wake up. And I was told to leave the premises because there was no space for me. I lost control. So that's the first case study. I guess we'll break into some of the reading of the questions, which will be feelings and emotions. Here, I guess there's disbelief, anger, feelings of judgment, rejection and unimportance, despair, resentment, great distrust. What happened afterwards? Well, her anger escalated. I called my mom. She was in disbelief and angry towards the system. And I went straight to a nearby hotel to buy drugs and started consuming again. How to do it differently. Don't make promises you can't keep. Take the time to sit together and talk. No matter how many times a person is in need and asks for help, we need to listen, to be kind, compassionate, and respectful. We have to provide services and or refer other services. Okay. So the reflections, I guess.
No,
Nope,
I
we'll
think we,
Yeah, I'll
Uh,
stop sharing.
Okay, yeah. Okay,
yeah,
so
and then,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I guess that's the case study we're going to leave you guys on, so you guys can reflect on it during our break, and then we're going to stop the recording so we can facilitate a safe space and create dialogue.